Hello, my name's Tim Shoebridge. Welcome to this video and welcome to my thoughts on this synthesizer. Right here in front of me, it's the very versatile and very unique Vermona Perfourmer Mark II. Right, so I've got the Perfourmer in front of me here. I've got it hooked up to my Roland MC707, which is basically adding effects. It's also a sequencer, clearly. So for some of the patch examples, I'll be using the sequencer on board the 707. But for the moment, I'm just going to be using it to add a little bit of reverb. I've also got my trusty Arturia keystep here, so I can play the synth. So it sounds like this. So there's just a few basic things that we need to talk about with the Perfourmer, because as we go through this video, I'll be picking out different ways that I think the Perfourmer is unique, or it's able to create beautiful sounds, and it all comes down to something called play modes. So we'll get onto play modes in a little while, but first we just need to cover the basics of it, which is just the architecture, and it really is quite simple. So let's briefly look at the architecture. There's a lot of knobs on the front panel. It does look complicated, but actually when you look at it, we have the same set of repeating controls over and over again. Actually, the simplest way to think about the Perfourmer is that it is 4 independent mono synths all in one box. And each mono synth is very simple, very simple architecture. We have a single oscillator, a single filter, which is a low-pass filter, a single envelope generator, an LFO, and a little amplifier section, and that's it. And that's basically what we have here, repeated 4 times. So you really can think of it as 4 monosynths in a box, and you can play it multi-timbrally. By multi-timbrally, I mean that you can set up completely different patches on each of the monosynths, and play them completely independently of one another. You can set them up so they listen to different MIDI channels and control it from a multi-track sequencer, keyboard, whatever you want to do. And that's a very popular way of people playing this synth, especially on YouTube, where they're doing jams and live performances. But there's a whole load of different ways that you can combine these very simple synth voices, these little monosynths. And that's where the sort of the power of the Perfourmer comes, and where its sonic capabilities come from. So that's where I'm going to be concentrating on. So let's talk about these different play modes in a little bit more detail. So I've already talked about multi-timbral mode, which is each of the synth voices listening to a different MIDI channel and playing its own sound, whatever you want to do with it. But let's look at the flip side of that, which is all of the synth voices listening to the same MIDI channel, because you've got everywhere in between. You can configure this exactly how you want to. You could have this one and this one listening to one MIDI channel, this one to another, this one to another. However you want to configure the synth is entirely up to you, and it's very quick and simple to do that. But let's talk about everything listening to one MIDI channel and see what our options are in terms of play modes. Now, play modes are this control here. There are 6 of them. We've got 2 mono modes, 2 duo modes, and 2 poly modes. So let's look at the mono modes first of all. So by mono mode, I mean monophonic mode. And by monophonic mode, I mean 1 note at a time, a mono synth. Now, we have 2 modes. And the difference between those modes is how the synth determines which of these synth voices to play with each note that we play. So mode number 1 is actually unison mode. All the synth voices play the same note. So if I hold down a key, what What you're hearing there is all 4 voices playing at the same time, and you can see they're playing at the same time by the little red LED on the left hand side here. While I've got the key held down, you'll see the light is on. I let go, the light goes off. We're hearing all 4 voices at the same time, unison. So that's mono mode number 1. Mono mode number 2, it's still monophonic, it's still 1 note at a time, but you'll see when you look at the LEDs here on the left hand side, you'll see how the synth is handing out those notes to these synth voices. You'll see there that we only ever have 1 synth voice playing at any time, and it cycles through them sequentially, kind of like a round robin. Now, just the same way that a digital synth playing a sample with round robins to just get a little bit of variety, you have like different samples. Each time you press a key, it's a different sound. You've got that capability with the Perfourmer here because it's an all analog synth. You're not going to get each of your synth voices sounding exactly the same, no matter how much you try with the controls. There's going to be some subtle differences, and that really is one of the reasons why you can get some beautiful sounds out of the Perfourmer, because you have this round robin effect. Right, so the first of these duo modes, it's not duophonic, it's still monophonic, so we can still just play 1 note at a time. But what the synth is now doing is it's pairing up these synth voices, these little monosynths. We're playing these 2 together and these 2 together. So if you watch the LEDs again, you'll see what's going on. These 2 playing together, and now these 2. Back to these, back to these. So you get that kind of same round robin effect, but we've just got 2 voice pairs that are playing. But because the voices are paired together, it means you can get some really lovely effects. You could get some little subtle detune effects, or quite drastic detune effects. You can create some much more sonically rich patches with 2 voices together than you can just with 1. So that's the first of the duo modes. The second duo mode is real duophonic. It's exactly the same as before, but we are allowed to play 2 notes at the same time. Right, on to the poly modes. So what's the difference between these 2 poly modes? Because on the face of it, they sound exactly the same. This is poly mode number 1. And this is poly mode number 2. Now the thing is, the difference between them is dependent on your playing style. Let me try and explain. Poly mode number 2 is the most natural way of working. It's like a regular polysynth. If you hold down so many notes that you use up all of your synth voices, then what does that synth do when you press down another note? Either you're not going to hear it at all, or it's going to have to steal one of those synth voices. If I hold down a 5th note, it's going to steal one of the ones that I've got there. Now we can't tell which one it is that's stolen until I let go of that note. When I let go of that note, the light will go out. So it stole synth voice number 1, and now synth voice number 1 is no longer being used. The light's gone out, which means it's available for me to play as much as I like. Still holding down these 4 here. But what if I was to hold down that 5th key and keep it held down and play a 6th key? It's stolen another synth voice, and I'll show you which one by letting go of it. It's stolen synth voice number 4. So there's an algorithm in here, an intelligence as to what to do when I've run out of voices and you want to play another note. Voice stealing is a very, very normal and natural behavior for a polysynth. If I go to poly mode number 1, and I do the same things before, I hold down 4 keys, occupying all 4 of these. Now listen to what happens when I press another key. It's stolen the voice and it's played it, but listen to what happens when I let go. It re-triggers the note that was playing before. So the multi-trigger or legato aspects of this synth now come into play with poly mode number 1, and it's something that we haven't covered yet. But with any monophonic synth, you have hopefully got the capability of having a legato way of playing. If I go back to mono, so we just play one note at a time. If I hold down a note and I press another note, like that, at the moment the synth is not in legato mode, it's in re-trigger mode. So every time you hold down a note, the envelopes get triggered. So I'm cutting out the first note by playing the second one. And what happens when I let go is it re-triggers that first note again. That's what we were seeing in poly mode number 1, that re-triggering. Legato mode is you only trigger the envelopes with the first note that's held down. Any subsequent notes don't. Let me just quickly show you that. I'll just go into the edit menu and turn legato on. Now, that's legato mode. Obviously I've got quite short decays going on with this particular patch. But that's regular legato mode. And this is multi-trigger mode. And it's weird because this sort of like multi-trigger versus legato mode, single trigger modes, it's something you don't normally get involved in with polysynths. Polysynths behave like poly mode number 2. Whenever you hold down another note, it voice steals, it takes over one of your voices to play that new note, and the previous note is lost and never come back to. But with poly mode number 1, you get this kind of combination of legato versus multi-triggering versus poly all rolled into one. It's rather weird to get your head round, but it can create some really wonderful results. So if that bit about poly modes and legato mode versus multi-trigger mode got a little bit complicated, that's because it kind of is at the end of the day. You've got a lot of flexibility here with this synth, and you can come up with some really, quite surprising things. Sometimes it's not possible to determine in advance how the synth is going to sound based on your selections, because you've got which MIDI channels you choose each synth voice response to. On top of that, you've got, as another dimension if you like, you've got which of these modes you want to play, and then on top of that you've got legato on, legato off. So you've got like these 3 dimensions of configurations that are very, very quick and simple to do. But give you, like, not endless, but an awful lot of different combinations of playing style and ways to get sound out of the synth. So it can be quite complicated to try and get your head around all these different ways that you can change things. But I tend to levitate to 2 or 3 different combinations, playing it naturally in poly mode, playing it in unison mode, and playing it in monophonic round robin mode are my 3 favourites for sure. But there's an awful lot of great, wonderful sounds that you can get from this synth by coming up with unusual combinations. So I know, coming back to what I was talking about before, that those different play modes combined with legato versus multi-trigger, combined with choice of MIDI channels, all of those choices might seem a little bit daunting at first, and they all have an effect on the kinds of sounds you can get out of the synth. It doesn't actually stop there. I've actually been breaking you in gently with this thing, because although I said that you can think of these as 4 independent monosynths, and they are capable of being completely independent from one another, you can also make them dependent on each other. Let me try and explain that. So you'll see here these LFOs are all flashing together. They're perfectly in sync across all 4 voices. That's because there's a little switch here which tells this synth voice to synchronize its LFO with the one above it. So you can see that at the moment it's going really, really slowly, but as soon as I flip the switch, it's now synced with the one above. These ones down here are going really, really slowly, but I can flip the switch, sync that one to that one, and then if I want to sync this one to this one, another switch. So you can synchronize the rate of the LFOs to the one above it. So that's just one element of how you can link these separate synth voices together. The other ways that you can link them together is in terms of oscillator sync, hard sync. You can hard sync the oscillator to the one above it. So the same way that you can sync the LFOs, you can sync the oscillators. And again, if you think about it, you could be syncing these oscillators while they're playing completely separate parts. I mean, normally when you think about oscillator sync, you're thinking about syncing multiple oscillators inside a single synth voice. But here you can sync across synth voices. So again, if this is playing a bass and this is playing a lead, I can still sync this oscillator's frequency to the one above it, even though it might be playing different notes at different times to the one above it, the effects that you can get are quite unpredictable and can be very, very interesting. And the other way you can link these synth voices together is frequency modulation. So you can apply frequency modulation again based on the frequency of the oscillator above, either to this oscillator or to the filter. So if I were to quickly just listen to these two on their own, so I'll just switch those to be MIDI channel number 1 and not the other one, so we don't hear them. And I go to a mono patch where we're going to see them both playing at the same time. So if I turn this control to the right, cutoff frequency is being modulated. According to the frequency of this oscillator. And if I turn it to the left, it's the oscillator's own frequency that's being modulated by the one above. Right, so let's talk about multi-timbral mode of playing with this performer. There is no, play mode here called multi-timbral. What I mean by multi-timbral is take each of the synth voices, configure them to listen to their own unique MIDI channel, and that way you can treat them as totally independent monosynths and play them from a multi-track sequencer like the MC707 here, or a Squid, or an Octatrack, or whatever you want to use. It's a really popular way of playing this synth in a live scenario. You can even take the audio outs from each of these synths and route them to their own independent effects if that's what you want to do. It's a very flexible approach. Now, having had a very, very good long, hard look on the internet for people doing live performances, there's one gentleman who stands out as being a bit of a master at the performer. His name is Federico. He goes by the artist name of Ura, and his YouTube channel is called Ura Music. I really do strongly suggest that you check out his channel if you are interested at all in this synth. You probably already know his channel as you're watching this video. I'm going to show you now just a tiny little glimpse of the kind of magic that he can create with this instrument. Wasn't that wonderful? Wonderful sounds from Ura just then. To be honest with you, that little snippet really doesn't do his music justice. He does these wonderful evolving live sets. You really need to watch his videos in full to appreciate them. Now for me personally, my personal point of view, I'm not a live performance artist. I don't do any live performances. I don't do any live streams. I record in my studio, and that's the only way that I use synthesizers. And so for me, it just doesn't make sense to use a multi-timbral instrument to be playing multiple synth parts at the same time just to be able to record them. You know, I will record one synth part at a time using a monosynth of my choice, record it on my DAW, stack up those audio parts, you know, multi-track recording basically, and that's how I will achieve my recordings. And you know, and when I look at a single voice here on the Perfourmer, it is a very, very basic voice. You've just got one single oscillator, no sub oscillator, no second oscillator. You've got a very understated filter, shall I say it like that. It hasn't got a huge amount of character. And I know that that makes sense when you are playing all four voices together. You don't want filters screaming and shouting at you. You want subtlety, and you know, polysynths have, you know, subtle filters generally. But on its own, to play a mono part, it's not the most characterful. I would choose a different filter. And in terms of modulation capabilities, you've just got that one envelope generator, and there are going to be quite a number of occasions when it would be nice to have more than one, especially when you might want to use it to modulate the pitch one way and the filter a different way, as well as the amplitude another way. So for me personally, to record synths in the studio, I would use a different monosynth rather than a single Perfourmer voice. That's just a personal preference. But I understand why Vermona have made these choices in terms of a really quite a basic synth voice, because if you look at the front panel, there's well over 70 knobs on it and a whole load of switches as well. And if they were to add a second oscillator, or just a sub oscillator, or a second envelope generator, they would be increasing the number of controls here, and I think it would become really quite unmanageable. I think they've done some very, very careful choices here as to what to provide on the front panel, so that from a live performance point of view, it is a manageable experience. And you know, as I say, I'm not a live performer, but my guess is that they've got it really quite well, and you know, done a good job in terms of their designs. So you know, there's a reason why they've done what they've done. The Perfourmer, from that point of view, you can see that it is really geared around live performance as sort of like a primary use, and obviously there's a big hint in the name, it's a Perfourmer. So, if like me, you're not a live performer and you also don't need a multi-timbral instrument in your studio, then is there still a place for the Vermona Perfourmer in your synth arsenal? And the answer to that, as far as I'm concerned, is definitely yes, there is, for two main reasons. Let's cover the first reason, which is experimentation. This synth, with all of those controls on the front panel and all the different ways that you can utilize these synth voices, combine them or not combine them, sort of like leads to an awful lot of wonderful experimentation possibilities. You can get some very predictable and some very unpredictable results out of this synth. I'll try and give you an example now. Now, when I was talking about frequency modulation earlier in the video, I realized I didn't make it clear that when you are frequency modulating one synth voice with the one above it, it's not the raw oscillator that is actually doing the frequency modulation, it's the output from the synth voice as a whole. That means that if you've got some filter applied and maybe some self-resonance going on there, that is going to have an effect on the frequency modulation of the synth voice below. And if you've got an envelope enforced as well, so that maybe the sound cuts out completely, then that's also going to have an effect on the frequency modulation, because if there's no sound coming out of the synth voice above, then there is no frequency modulation at that point. So it's an awful lot more complex picture than just standard frequency modulation, standard FM that's going on here. And that's what I'm going to try and show you with this little example of how you can get some fairly unpredictable results out of something quite predictable. So hopefully you can see here there are two LEDs flashing at different times. There are two different sequences being played with synth voice 1 and 2. We're not concerned about 3 and 4 at all. We're not going to hear those. We're actually just going to hear synth voice number 2, and I'm going to frequency modulate it with synth voice number 1. Now I've got these two sequences going on. They're being played right now by the MC707. I'll just play them to you in isolation so you can hear what these sequences sound like. So let's start off with synth voice number 1. Very, very simple. I'm going to try frequency modulating synth voice number 2 with this sawtooth sound, and I'm going to play around with the filter a little bit as well, and I'm also going to try with noise with that. Sounds like Terminator 2, doesn't it? Better turn that off quickly before I get a copyright strike. So that's what we're going to be frequency modulating synth voice number 2 with. Now let's listen to what synth voice number 2 is playing as a sequence. It sounds like this. So let's try. Now there's no frequency modulation going on right now, because even though I've got it set here with this control, it's not up, so that means 0. We've got some frequency modulation here. We can't hear any because I've turned the oscillator off, so that whole synth voice is generating no sound at all. As soon as I turn it to noise, we get this wonderful rhythmic sound going on because we're playing a completely different sequence with envelopes involved compared to the synth voice below. Let's try the sawtooth. And let's try playing around with the resonance a little bit. Hear how it changes the modulation? I hope that last music example didn't disturb you too much. It certainly disturbed my cat, who was jumping all over the keyboard while I was recording it. It was a bit weird. As well as experimentation, I think the second compelling reason for having the Performer in your synth arsenal is variation. And what I mean by that is you have these 4 completely independent synth voices, can be completely independent, and that gives you a variation in sound from one note to the next. Now that variation in sound can be really, really subtle, or it can be really quite extreme. It's entirely up to you what you want to do. Now in terms of subtle variation, I think that is really sort of like emulating, you know, the lovely sounds that you can get from a vintage polysynth. You know, for me personally, one of the main reasons why a vintage polysynths sound so lovely is that it doesn't matter what you do with the front panel controls inside that synth, there's going to be calibration differences from one synth voice to the next. The envelopes, the filter, the oscillators, they're going to sound very, very slightly different from one another. And that's a beautiful variation that you can recreate with the Performer, and I think it's a really big part of the charm of the Performer sound. When you combine that variation, whether it is subtle or extreme, with the Performer's interesting choices of which synth voice to play which note with, then you can get some really wonderful and musical tones coming out of this synth, whether you're playing a sequence or an arpeggio. Or whether you're playing chords. Right, so I appreciate this video is getting quite long. It's probably time for me to sort of come to some conclusions, sort of summarize my feelings about the Performer Mark II. Are there any things about it that I don't like? I think that the main sort of niggle I have is that some of the controls are really quite sensitive, especially the controls where you are changing the pitch of the oscillators, for example, the tune controls. If you want to sort of like dial in some really gentle detune, then they are a bit fiddly to get right. Same with the LFO modulation of pitch. If you just want some gentle vibrato, it's really quite difficult to dial in a subtle amount. They haven't got a kind of exponential sort of like feedback to these controls, so that for me it's a little bit fiddly. Talking about fiddly, there are times when you just don't want to have to play with 70 knobs. You want simplicity sometimes. Sometimes it's great to have all these knobs to play with, and sometimes it's not. Playing with the Performer Mark II, especially if you're building up a patch which involves all 4 synth voices, that's an awful lot of setting of controls, and then that's just for that one patch. So when you want the next patch, you're basically having to destroy everything you've done and start from scratch and reset everything manually. There's an awful lot of knob twiddling that goes on here. It really does remind me of my experiences of polychaining synthesizers, monosynths together. I did a video a long time ago of polychaining the Behringer Model Ds. I had 4 of them, and that was quite an experience, and I got fed up with it, actually. So yeah, it kind of reminds me of that. The thing is, that since my polychaining experience of those Model Ds, I've really got into Eurorack and modular gear, and that is an incredibly laborious task, setting up patches. Not only are you dealing with knobs and sliders and switches, but you're also dealing with cables as well. So I think that if you are into Eurorack, then you'll find that whole experience of sort of like completely manual setup of a patch, throw it away, start again, you'll find that all very natural. And I think now we're talking about Eurorack here for a second, I think that this is the right time to talk about alternatives to the Vermona Perfourmer and what competition there is out there, because it really is quite a unique instrument, having these four completely independent monosynths in one. It is quite a unique instrument. Out of the synths that I own, the one single sort of like competitor to it that I can think of is actually this here. Let's see if I can get that in camera. It's by Dreadbox. It's called the Abyss. It's a 4-voice polysynth. In fact, they don't make it anymore, so it's probably not fair to mention it here. But this synth has actually got two different voicing modes. You can either play it as a 4-voice polysynth, or with a flick of a switch on the back, you can send it into multi-timbral mode, and you can address each of those 4 voices on a separate MIDI channel. So from that point of view, it's really quite similar to the Perfourmer, though the Perfourmer goes a lot further in terms of the different voice modes and the way that you can allocate MIDI channels. And that's the closest that I could think of, the Abyss from Dreadbox, in terms of the Perfourmer. Yes, you could polychain monosynths together. Certainly that will give you the experience of having playing polyphonically multiple synth voices that are all independent from one another, and that can work really, really well. Or you can just daisy chain with MIDI a bunch of monosynths together, and then that will give you a sort of unison playing as well. So those kinds of ways of working certainly is an alternative to the Perfourmer. But there's something about having those 4 synth voices all in one box right in front of you, with identical layouts. It's very tactile. It can become second nature to play around with the controls and get results. So I think that having everything in one box certainly has its advantages. But then coming back to Eurorack, I think that there is a very viable alternative to the Vermona Perfourmer. You have got total flexibility with Eurorack as to what your synth voice looks like, what its oscillators are, how many of them there are, what the filters are that you choose, envelope generators, modulation capabilities. You can build whatever you want to in terms of Eurorack. It's a completely manual experience. Of course, you've got cables to deal with as well, but it really, if you're in the studio, it really gets you to places that the Perfourmer gets you to, and a lot further as well, I have to say. So the Perfourmer has a lot of interesting voicing modes in terms of how it chooses which voices to play with each note, but there are some really quite sophisticated MIDI to CV converters for Eurorack available these days. They can do an awful lot of different modes: poly modes, duo modes, mono modes, etc. So I think that Eurorack is the most viable alternative to the Perfourmer. And so that really comes back to me and my personal sort of like feelings about the Perfourmer. As much as I've really, really enjoyed playing it and using it and learning it, it doesn't really do anything that I can't do with the Eurorack gear that I've got. I mean, if I was a live performer, I could see the benefit of the Perfourmer much more, but in the studio where I can take my time and build patches with cables and patch them in Eurorack, I'm not seeing a massive advantage to using the Perfourmer over Eurorack. So that's just my personal choice, but yours will clearly be different to me. So that's really it. That's all I've got time for with this video. I do hope you've enjoyed it. I do hope that there's been some information there that's useful to you. The Perfourmer is a wonderful sounding, fascinating and really unique instrument. It's really worth taking a close look at. I'm going to play out now with a little tiny little track that I put together. Very, very simple. It's just got a little piano patch, that piano patch that I had right at the beginning of the video. Just playing it with some chords and some little sequences going on. Really, really simple stuff. And that's how I've really actually enjoyed playing with the Perfourmer the most. So I hope you enjoy the track. Until the next time, as always, thank you very, very much for watching.
Rock, as we wrapping it up with one of your favourites.
It could be reality, but I think it's just about going out.
Hello, my name's Tim Schubert. Welcome to this video. I'm in the process of recording a thought of the synth. It's the Vermona Perfourmer Mark II. But it seems to me that I've been trying to get this video finished. Segments and then tearing them up, deleting them, starting again.
Besok percetakan undangan juga bisa tutup gitu ya. Karena itu gitu ya, sekarang kan udah biasa juga.
Probably the hardest thoughts on video I've ever tried to record. And welcome to my thoughts on this synthesizer right here in front of me. It's the very versatile and very unique Vermona Perfourmer Mark II.